All right, so get ready, because we're going deep, deep into the Renaissance, but not the one you might picture with just like the art and architecture. No,
Yeah.
no, we are going full-on intellectual here, diving into the life and the work of a philosopher, a guy named Francesco Patrizi. You might not have heard the name before, but trust me, he's a fascinating figure. Especially, well, since you're a philosopher yourself.
You see, what makes Patrizi so interesting, especially for a philosopher like you, is that he was this fierce critic of, like the big guy, the philosophical giant of the time, Aristotle. Just imagine questioning the very foundations of knowledge, like everything you know is wrong. That's what Patrizi did.
Now, luckily for us, we've got a great mix of sources for this deep dive. It's kind of like a greatest hits of Patrizi's life and thought. We're going to be pulling from some biographical information and then like some really deep philosophical analysis from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's
Yeah.
going to be a wild ride, I can already tell.
Yeah, we're going to try and explain Patrizi to you as if he was, like one of your contemporaries, like a fellow philosopher just wrestling with these big ideas. So we'll explore his background, his critiques of Aristotle, and his own like very unique take on Plato. It's going to be good.
Okay, so let's just start with the basics. Who was this guy? Who was Francesco Patrizi? Where does he fit into this whole Renaissance landscape?
All right, so picture this. It's 1529, and on this tiny little island off the coast of Dalmatia, Francesco Patrizi is born. He starts his academic journey, studying in his hometown, then he ends up in Venice, then Ingolstadt, all over. And finally, he lands at the University of Padua in 1547.
Padua. Now, that was a real hub of, intellectual activity during the Renaissance, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. But here's where it gets interesting. Patrizi actually enrolled, to study medicine.
Yeah.
But very quickly, like almost immediately, he switched gears, went straight to the humanities. I mean, even early on, you can see his curiosity is pulling him towards something bigger, something beyond just the physical world.
So he wasn't content with just like the nuts and bolts of the body, right?
Mhm.
He wanted those bigger questions about existence and knowledge and the universe. A true philosopher at heart, it seems.
Precisely. And what makes him even more interesting is that he wasn't just a philosopher. This guy was a true Renaissance polymath. I mean, we're talking poet, historian, military strategist, even dabbled in utopian thinking. This guy, he wanted to grasp it all, every facet of knowledge.
That's pretty incredible. This kind of like multifaceted approach to learning and knowledge is something I really admire. But let's get to the heart of his philosophical work. Why did Patrizi have such a bone to pick with Aristotle? I mean, Aristotle was basically the intellectual rock star of the time, wasn't he?
You're right, Aristotle was the authority. In the universities and intellectual circles, I mean, everywhere during the Renaissance. To challenge him, that was a bold move, audacious even. Like, imagine a philosopher today just, publicly refuting some widely accepted theory by like a leading figure. That's what this was.
So what was it about Aristotle's philosophy that Patrizi found so, I don't know, objectionable? Was it a specific idea, or was it like a broader disagreement with his whole approach?
Well, Patrizi didn't just disagree with, like specific conclusions or something. He took issue with the entire, like the foundation of Aristotle's thought. He argued that from the ground up, Aristotle's core ideas about matter, form, and the structure of the cosmos were flawed, fundamentally flawed.
Okay, now that is a pretty big claim. I need specifics. Give me some examples of these like fundamental flaws that Patrizi identified.
All right. Take the concept of the vacuum. Aristotle completely denied it existed. He argued that space could not exist without matter. But Patrizi, he argued, vehemently, I might add, for the possibility of a vacuum. He was saying that space could exist independently of matter.
Wow, so that's a pretty fundamental difference, right? It seems like this is more than just a scientific concept. It reflects like two completely different ways of understanding the nature of reality.
You're getting it. It goes right to the heart of their worldviews. For Aristotle, reality was material. Like everything was composed of matter and form. But Patrizi, no. There was a realm beyond the material, a realm of pure space and light, which he thought was more fundamental than matter itself.
Fascinating. So it's not just a scientific quibble about vacuums. It's a philosophical battle royale about the very nature of existence.
Exactly. And this difference in worldview, well, it shaped their approaches to knowledge, too. Aristotle, with his focus on observation and empirical data, he favored, I guess you could say, like a bottom-up approach.
You mean like he started with the observable world and then worked his way up to the more abstract principles?
Precisely. But Patrizi, no, he preferred a top-down approach. He believed in starting with those first principles, those fundamental truths about the nature of God, light, and the cosmos, and then using those principles to understand the physical world.
So he was more interested in the why behind things,
Yeah.
right? Like the underlying principles that kind of govern reality rather than just the what of the observable world.
Exactly. And that difference in method, it's key to understanding the tension between them. It's not just about disagreeing on the details. It's two entirely different ways of approaching knowledge itself.
This is where it gets really interesting for me as a, philosopher. How did Patrizi actually go about challenging Aristotle's, like very deeply entrenched ideas?
Yeah.
Did he just shout his disagreements from the rooftops, or was he a little more strategic?
Oh, Patrizi was a scholar, not a rabble-rouser. He took a meticulous approach, employing a method they called comparatio, which was pretty common among Renaissance intellectuals, actually.
Comparatio. Sounds like some kind of, I don't know, philosophical duel.
In a way, it was. It involved carefully comparing the ideas of different thinkers, highlighting their strengths, their weaknesses, and ultimately arguing for, like the superiority of one perspective over another. It was a way to elevate the discourse, to have a real debate, rather than just blindly accepting the established dogma.
So it's like a philosophical courtroom, right?
Right.
Where different ideas are presented, evidence is weighed, and a verdict is ultimately reached. I love it.
Exactly. And Patrizi, with his sharp intellect and his deep, deep knowledge of ancient philosophy, he was a master of this comparatio method. He meticulously compared Aristotle to other thinkers, particularly Plato, and he exposed what he saw as, flaws in Aristotle's logic and these inconsistencies in his arguments.
So it sounds like he was building a case, like piece by piece,
Yeah.
Carefully taking down Aristotle's authority and setting up his own alternative vision. But hold on, if he's critiquing Aristotle, why bring Plato into the mix? Weren't they from, like, totally different schools of thought?
That's a great question, and it leads us to, the next really fascinating layer of Patrizi's thought. He wasn't just trying to dismantle Aristotle, he was building something new. And for Patrizi, well, Plato was a key inspiration.
So it's not just demolition, it's reconstruction. He's not just an Aristotle slayer, he's a Plato enthusiast too.
Exactly, but it's not as simple as just swapping one philosophical giant for another. Patrizi wasn't just a, Plato fanboy. He was building a new system, a new universal philosophy, he called it. And he was blending Platonic ideas with his own unique insights.
Okay, so it's Plato plus Patrizi, a blend of that ancient wisdom and some Renaissance innovation. I am hooked. Tell me more about this new universal philosophy. What's the big idea? Where did he lay out this grand vision?
He lays it all out in his magnum opus, and the title is, well, it's as ambitious as the project itself, Nova de Universis Philosophia, which translates to, you guessed it, New Universal Philosophy.
I mean, that title just screams ambition. What's the structure of this work? How did he organize all these ideas?
He divided into 4 parts, Panagia, Panarchia, Pampsychia, and Pancosmia. Each one's a key pillar of his system.
Okay, I'm going to need a little help with those terms. They sound like they came straight out of Greek mythology textbook.
They might sound a little intimidating, but bear with me. They actually represent some pretty fascinating concepts. Panagia means all splendor, and it focuses on God as the first light. And right away, this is huge, like a major departure from Aristotle's focus on God as the unmoved mover. For Patrizi, light was the fundamental principle, the very beginning of existence.
Interesting. So that concept of light, which we talked about earlier, it takes center stage right from the start. It's like he's building this whole system on the idea of divine radiance.
Exactly. And then in the next part, Panarchia, or all principles, Patrizi outlines his concept of a 10-level ontology, like this hierarchical structure of existence flowing from God all the way down to the material world. It's kind of like that classic chain of being idea that was popular during the Renaissance, but, with Patrizi's own distinctive twist.
So he's taking this familiar concept of the chain of being and putting his own spin on it. What kind of twist? What sets his chain of being apart?
Well, for Patrizi, this chain of being wasn't just some static hierarchy. It was dynamic, this flow of energy and being with each level, like emanating from the one above it. Think of it as a cascade of divine light flowing down from God and giving rise to all levels of existence.
That's a beautiful image. It really highlights how central that concept of light is to his whole system.
You got it. Light, it's the unifying principle, the source of all creation, and the key to understanding Patrizi's new universal philosophy.
Okay, so we've got God as the first light and this dynamic chain of being. What about those other 2 parts of his Nova? What do Ampsychia and Pancosmia bring to the table?
All right, so Pampsychia means all soul. and it explores the nature of the soul, right? And its role as this bridge between the spiritual and physical realms. For Patrizi, the soul isn't just something, trapped in our bodies. It's this vital link that connects us to something much, much larger than ourselves.
So the soul is like a mediator, right?
Mm.
It helps bridge the gap between that divine light of God and the material world.
Exactly. And then there's pancosmia. It means all cosmos. And it lays out Patrizi's own model of the universe. It brings in all his innovative ideas about space, which we'll get into a little later. It's his cosmological masterpiece, this grand vision of the structure and the workings of the universe.
Okay, so we've got God as light, this hierarchy of existence, the soul is this connector, and a new model of the cosmos. That is a lot to unpack.
It is. But it's all connected, you see, by this underlying thread of light. This idea of divine radiance that flows through all levels of existence. It's bold, ambitious, and a truly unique philosophical system. And, we're just getting started.
I can't wait to dive deeper.
So, we were just talking about Patrizi and his criticism of Aristotle and his love for Plato. Well, that whole conflict, it goes even deeper.
Yeah.
Because you got to see his fascination with, pre-Platonic sources, especially these Hermetic texts.
Wait, hold on. He went back even further than Plato. That's interesting.
Yep.
Especially since those Hermetic texts were later, completely debunked, right? Like they were forgeries.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what he saw in them, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's what's so intriguing. Patrizi saw echoes of these older kind of mystical ideas in Plato himself. And he used those connections to, bolster his arguments against Aristotle. It's like he was, unearthing this hidden philosophical lineage, this chain of wisdom that goes way back, to a time before the philosophers we normally think about when we think of, classical thought.
So he's almost like reconstructing a lost philosophical tradition using Plato and these Hermetic texts, as his building blocks.
Yeah, exactly. And this ties into a concept that, some people call it perennial philosophy. It's this idea that there are these timeless truths that just keep popping up throughout history. Often they're hidden beneath all these layers of cultural and intellectual change. Patrizi seemed to be really searching for those core truths, those fundamental principles that he thought, underpinned everything, all of reality.
So it's like he's on this philosophical treasure hunt, piecing together clues from across centuries, trying to find this hidden map to the universe. But let's be real. Getting caught up in texts that were later, revealed to be fakes, that could be seen as kind of a misstep, right?
It definitely raises some questions about his judgment, sure. And it's interesting to compare him to another Renaissance guy who was also drawn to Hermeticism, Giordano Bruno.
Ah, yes, Giordano Bruno.
Bruno went way further down that path. He embraced these much more radical ideas, pantheistic ideas. And that ultimately led to his condemnation by the church.
Wow. Yeah. Being burned at the stake for your philosophical ideas. That's a pretty stark reminder of the risks involved in challenging the intellectual status quo, right?
Absolutely. It shows you that precarious balance intellectuals like Patrizi had to walk.
Yeah.
They were pushing boundaries, they were questioning authority, and in some cases promoting ideas that were seen as, heretical by the church. It was a dangerous game.
Yeah, no kidding. So while Patrizi was obviously a bold thinker, he was also a little more cautious than Bruno. He was walking a tightrope, right? Trying to put out new ideas without, going too far and crossing that line into outright heresy. But let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Patrizi's contributions to, what we might consider the beginnings of modern science. His ideas about space, especially, were pretty groundbreaking for his time, weren't they?
Oh, they totally were. In fact, his work in this area, it actually foreshadowed later scientific thought in some really fascinating ways. He made this really crucial distinction between, mathematical space and physical space, which was, way ahead of his time.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for me. What did he mean by mathematical space versus physical space? It sounds a little, abstract.
It is abstract, but it's also incredibly insightful. See, Patrizi thought of mathematical space as this pure abstract realm that existed before everything. Think of it like a perfect blueprint, or this geometric framework upon which the whole physical universe is built. Physical space, on the other hand, that's the realm of concrete existence. That's where things actually are, where they have resistance and interact with each other.
So, okay, mathematical space is the ideal form, the perfect template. And then physical space is the messy, real-world version of that template.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that distinction, it was huge. It let Patrizi think about space in a more I guess you could say, dynamic and nuanced way than anyone before him. He understood that space wasn't just this passive container for objects. It had its own properties, its own role to play in the workings of the universe.
It's like he was laying the groundwork for a more like mathematical and scientific approach to understanding the cosmos, which, eventually led to the scientific revolution.
Exactly. His work was a bridge between those philosophical ideas of the Renaissance and the empirical investigations of the scientific revolution. You can even see echoes of Patrizi's ideas in, like, Leibniz, who developed that concept of force, something that Patrizi's ideas about physical space kind of hinted at, prefigured.
That's amazing. So you have this Renaissance philosopher steeped in the classics, but he's also making these groundbreaking contributions to the way we think about space and the physical universe. It's like he's straddling two worlds, bridging the gap between ancient wisdom and modern science.
He really is, and that's part of what makes him so fascinating and so important. He wasn't just repeating what the ancients said, he was pushing the boundaries of knowledge, exploring new territory, and in some cases, laying the foundation for those future scientific discoveries.
Now, let's rewind a bit and revisit his critique of Aristotle. We talked about his alternative view of the vacuum and his embrace of Plato, but what were some of his other major, I don't know, points of contention with Aristotle? Where else did their philosophical paths diverge?
Well, one key area was their understanding of, well, the nature of light. Remember, for Patrizi, light was the fundamental principle, the source of all being. But Aristotle had a more, I guess you could say, limited view of light. He saw it as a quality of objects rather than a substance itself.
So for Aristotle, light was kind of like a secondary thing, like a property that things have, whereas for Patrizi, it was the primary stuff of the universe, the very foundation of reality.
Exactly. And that difference in their understanding of light, well, it had huge implications for their whole philosophical systems. It shaped how they thought about everything, from the nature of God to the structure of the cosmos.
It's amazing how one seemingly simple concept, like light, can become this major point of philosophical debate. It reveals these really deep differences in how people understand the world.
It really does. It's a testament to the power of ideas and to the importance of examining even our most basic assumptions about reality.
Now, speaking of examining assumptions, I want to go back to Patrizi's critique of Aristotle's methodology. We've talked about how he preferred that top-down approach, starting with those first principles rather than empirical observations. But what were some of the specific, I don't know, flaws that he saw in Aristotle's methods? Like, what was he getting at?
One of his big criticisms was that Aristotle's reliance on observation and categorization could sometimes lead to a superficial understanding of things. He argued that, yeah, it's important to observe the world, but you need to go deeper to search for those underlying principles that govern the observations.
So it's like saying that just, making a list of all the types of birds in a forest,
Yeah.
it doesn't really tell you much about the ecological forces that created that diversity. You need to go deeper to the underlying principles of biology, of ecology.
Exactly. And Patrizi believed that Aristotle's methods, while they were, useful for understanding the material world, they weren't enough for grasping those deeper truths of the universe, those eternal, unchanging principles that he saw as the foundation of all knowledge.
So it wasn't that he completely rejected observation, right? It's just that he saw it as a starting point, not the end goal. For him, the real philosophical work, it began after the observation when you start to ask the why questions.
Yeah.
The questions about the underlying causes and principles.
Precisely. He was a philosopher who wasn't content with just describing the world as it appeared. He wanted to understand the why, the how, the deeper meaning behind the things we see.
This makes him sound like a true scientist at heart, always looking for a deeper explanation, some unifying principle that ties everything together.
He was definitely a pioneer, someone who was willing to question the established methods of his time, explore those new ways of thinking about knowledge, about reality.
Now, let's go back to that magnum opus, the Nova de Universus Philosophia, and dig a little deeper into those four parts. We touched on Panagia with its concept of God as first light, and Panarchia with its unique take on the chain of being. But what about those other two sections, Pampsychia and Pancosmia? What's going on there?
All right, so Pampsychia, meaning all soul, that's where Patrizi lays out his whole theory of the soul.
Yeah.
And remember, for him, the soul wasn't just this, this immaterial essence floating around inside us. It was this vital force, this connecting principle that links the spiritual realm with the physical.
Interesting. So it's not just like a ghost in the machine. It's an active force that shapes and influences the material world.
Exactly. He saw the soul as this kind of intermediary between the divine light of God and the material universe. And he even distinguished between, the individual soul, which animates each living being, and then the world soul, which governs like the whole cosmos.
The world soul, that's a concept that I've come across in my own, philosophical studies. It's this fascinating idea that there's like this universal soul, a cosmic consciousness that kind of, pervades all of reality.
It is a captivating idea. And for Patrizi, the world soul wasn't just some, poetic metaphor. He saw it as a real force, this dynamic principle that infused the universe with life, with order. It was the intermediary between God's creative power and the material world.
So it's like the world soul is the conductor of the cosmic orchestra. It's harmonizing all the different parts into one, unified whole.
That's a great analogy. And it really reflects Patrizi's belief in the interconnectedness of everything, this idea that everything in the universe is ultimately linked back to that divine source.
Okay, so we've got the soul as this bridge between the spiritual and the physical. What about pancosmia? What insights into the cosmos does he offer there?
Pancosmia, meaning all cosmos. That's where he really lets loose his cosmological imagination. That's where he lays out his model of the universe, and it's a radical departure from the Aristotelian worldview that was, so dominant in his time.
I'm ready for some radical departures.
Yeah.
What did Patrizi's universe look like? Give it to me.
Well, first of all, he completely rejects Aristotle's model of a finite, Earth-centered universe, but with those crystalline spheres carrying the planets and the stars. Patrizi, he envisioned a universe that was infinite, just infinite in extent, filled with light and without any fixed center. It's a vision that's a lot closer to, our modern understanding of the cosmos.
Wow. That's a huge leap forward. It's like he's like taking a sledgehammer to the old Ptolemaic Aristotelian model and opening up this whole new like vista of space and possibility.
That's a great way to put it. And this vision of an infinite universe filled with light, it wasn't just, scientific speculation. It was deeply connected to his philosophical and theological beliefs. Remember, for Patrizi, light was the fundamental principle of existence, the source of all being. So an infinite universe filled with light was basically an infinite manifestation of the divine.
It's a beautiful and awe-inspiring vision. This cosmos is not just, vast and mysterious, but also, fundamentally divine, a reflection of God's like infinite creative power.
Exactly. And that vision was even further enhanced by his distinction between mathematical and physical space, which, we talked about earlier. That distinction allowed him to think of space as something more than just an empty container for objects. It was an active principle, this dynamic field that played a role in how the universe works.
So it's not just about what's in space, but about space itself, its properties, its role in shaping the cosmos. It's a much more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of space than what was like, common at the time.
You're absolutely right. And that sophisticated understanding of space, combined with his vision of this infinite universe filled with light, it makes Pancosmia a truly groundbreaking work. It shows you Patrizi's intellectual audacity, his willingness to challenge the status quo, and his ability to just envision a completely new way of understanding the cosmos.
Okay, so we've got a universe that's infinite, filled with light, and governed by a world soul. That is a pretty grand and awe-inspiring vision.
It is, and it's all underpinned by that core belief in the primacy of light, that divine radiance that flows through all levels of existence, from, the high spiritual realms down to the material world that we experience every day.
It really seems like this idea of light is the thread that ties all of Patrizi's ideas together. It's his golden key to unlocking the mysteries of the universe.
Exactly. It's his signature concept, the foundation upon which his entire philosophical system rests. And it's a concept that, it still resonates with us today, even as we explore the universe with, the tools of modern science.
Now, speaking of modern science, how did Patrizi's work influence, later thinkers and scientists? We talked about his impact on Leibniz, but were there others who kind of, picked up the torch and carried his ideas forward.
Oh, absolutely. His ideas, they had this ripple effect that went way beyond his own time. His work on space, for example, it was a precursor to the geometric thinking of later scientists, like Kepler and Galileo, who helped, bring about the scientific revolution.
So even though he wasn't like a scientist himself in the modern sense, his philosophical work was, helping to create that intellectual environment that would eventually give rise to modern science.
Exactly. And his influence wasn't just limited to science either. His work on the soul, for example, with its emphasis on the world soul and the interconnectedness of everything, it's resonated with thinkers in all sorts of fields, from philosophy and psychology to spirituality and even ecology.
Fascinating to think about how ideas can travel across time and space,
Mhm.
you know, influencing people in ways that the original thinker might never have even imagined.
It is. It really is. And it's a testament to the power of human thought,
Yeah.
to the enduring legacy of those who, dare to question, to explore, and to envision, those new possibilities.
Now, before we jump into the final part of our deep dive here, I want to touch on one more aspect of Patrizi's work that I find, well, particularly intriguing.
I'm all ears. What's caught your attention?
Well, it's his concept of the one all. It's the term he uses to describe God and his panagia. It seems like a very unique and nuanced understanding of the divine, and I'm curious to explore it a little bit further.
That's a great point. His concept of the one all is definitely central to his whole philosophical system, and it's worth, spending some time unpacking it.
So let's dive into that concept and see what we can uncover.
Absolutely. So to really understand Patrizi, especially as, you're a philosopher, we need to get into his idea of method. It's not just like what he believed, but how he got there, how he arrived at those beliefs.
Okay, but back up for a second. When you say method, what do you mean exactly in this context, I mean?
Well, back then, method was all about how you acquire knowledge, right?
Yeah.
It was the framework, the tools, the whole intellectual approach you use to, investigate the world and find the truth. Think of it like the scaffolding for your whole philosophical system.
Got it. So it's not just about having the right answers. It's about asking the right questions, using the right tools, and following a rigorous path to knowledge.
Mhm.
Right.
Exactly. And that's where Patrizi's critique of Aristotle goes beyond just like disagreeing with what he said. Patrizi was challenging Aristotle's whole approach to knowledge, his methodology. He
Right.
was saying that the way Aristotle went about building knowledge, it was flawed from the very beginning.
That's a pretty bold move, taking on the method itself. Can you give me like a concrete example of this methodological clash? How did their approaches actually differ?
Sure. Let's look at their views on the universe, right? Aristotle, like we've said, he favored that bottom-up approach. Started with observing the physical world very carefully, collecting data, and then building theories based on that empirical foundation.
It's like a scientist in a lab, carefully recording measurements and making observations, and then drawing conclusions based on the patterns they see.
Precisely. It's an inductive approach. You go from specific observations to broader generalizations. But Patrizi, no, he was more into the top-down approach. He believed in starting with those first principles, the fundamental truth about like God, light, the cosmos, and using those principles to interpret, the world around him.
So it's like you have this grand theory, these guiding principles, and then you see how those principles actually play out in the
Right.
world.
You're
It's more deductive.
Exactly. And that fundamental difference in method, that clash between the inductive and the deductive, that's key to understanding the huge gap between these two philosophers. It wasn't just, disagreeing on the ideas themselves. It was about how they thought knowledge should be pursued.
This is fascinating. It's like two architects arguing over the best way to design a building. One starts with the foundation, the other starts with a blueprint of the finished structure.
Perfect analogy. And for Patrizi, the right method, it meant connecting back to what he saw as the real sources of wisdom. The ancient philosophers, especially Plato, and even those Hermetic texts that, well, we know now were forgeries. He thought those thinkers had a more, I guess you could say, a more direct and uncorrupted access to those fundamental principles that he considered absolutely essential for true knowledge.
So it's not just about being anti-Aristotle. It's about finding a more, I don't know, a more authentic and reliable path to understanding the universe, a path that he thought was laid out by those ancient thinkers who were closer to, the divine source.
That's it. And this quest for the right method, it was a huge part of intellectual life during the Renaissance. It was a time of rediscovery. They were coming across all these ancient texts and this incredible body of knowledge. And thinkers like Patrizi, they were struggling with, how to make sense of it all, how to integrate all this new knowledge, sift through the mountains of information and find a solid foundation for understanding the world.
It's like having this library full of incredible books, but no Dewey Decimal System to help you find what you're looking for. You need a system, a method to make sense of it all.
Exactly. And Patrizi, with his criticism of Aristotle's methods and his embracing of that more Platonic approach, he was a pioneer in this methodological revolution. He was searching for a more rigorous way to get to knowledge, a more reliable way, and ultimately a more truthful way.
And as we've seen, that search took him down some interesting paths.
Yeah.
Like his whole thing with those Hermetic texts, which we know now were fake. It just goes to show you that even the most brilliant minds can stumble when they're searching for the truth.
Very true. It reminds us that, the pursuit of knowledge, it's a process, a journey with its ups and downs. But even those setbacks, like Patrizi and those Hermetic texts, well, they can teach us something, right? They teach us to be critical, to question what we think we know, and to always be open to changing our minds when we get new evidence.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that intellectual humility, it's just as important as brilliance. You have to be willing to admit when you're wrong and change course if you need to.
Absolutely. And I think Patrizi, even though he made some mistakes along the way, he really embodied that humility. He was constantly searching for truth, and he was willing to, change his methods, change his beliefs as he learned and grew.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Francesco Patrizi, what's the big takeaway about his idea of method? What can we learn from his struggles and his insights?
I think the key lesson is that the how of knowledge, it's just as important as the what, right?
Yeah.
It's not enough to just collect facts and information. You need a solid methodology, a rigorous approach to guide your inquiries and help you, find the truth.
And that methodology, as Patrizi showed us, it needs to be, constantly tested, refined, and maybe even revised as we come up against new challenges and new information.
Exactly. And I think that's a message that's really relevant today, in a time when we're bombarded with information and all these competing claims about what's true. We need to be careful, be critical thinkers, be aware of our own biases and assumptions, and be willing to adapt, to evolve as we continue on our own, journeys of knowledge and discovery.
Well said. And I think Francesco Patrizi, with his bold ideas, his willingness to challenge the accepted way of thinking, and his dedication to finding the truth, he's a great inspiration for all of us who are on that journey of seeking knowledge.
He really is. He reminds us that the quest for knowledge, it's an adventure. It's a journey with challenges, but also, with rewards. And it's a journey worth taking, even if it means questioning the status quo, challenging authority, and venturing into those uncharted intellectual territories.
So to our listener out there, the philosopher who's joined us for this deep dive, I hope you've been inspired by Patrizi's story, by his intellectual fearlessness and his commitment to seeking truth.
I hope his example encourages you to keep going on your own philosophical explorations, to question, to challenge, and to always, strive for a deeper understanding of the world and our place in it.
And until next time, keep those minds curious, keep those hearts open, and keep those spirits adventurous.